All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. It's an educational channel. We take a look at exciting, great theories of everything. All-encompassing theories, cosmologies, grand unified theories, magnum opuses, tour de forces, earth-shattering discoveries, to help you out with your paradigm shifting, your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview, your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health. We usually veer toward the obscure, and many of these readings are a little bit difficult. And so I try to hold your hand a little bit if you are daunted by some of this stuff, and maybe try to explain a little context or background information. But mostly I'm just going to be reading today. And today's our 16th episode that we've done on the book called The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception. And, I wouldn't classify this as a cosmology or an all-encompassing theory, but it's talking about a history of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and therefore also the Old Testament and the New Testament, and all of really scripture. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947 in a series of caves, in a series of findings in a series of caves in Qumran, about 20 miles east of Jerusalem. And they have, I believe, like 800 different documents, including copies of every Old Testament text other than Esther, but then also many other, what you call apocryphal texts that aren't included in the Old Testament, but not as of right now, but maybe in past times, or maybe other groups have them as part of their scriptures. This includes the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, and they also have a lot of sectarian material, which is material that's just kind of like the rules and regulations and customs of the sect that wrote all this stuff up. And these people, I guess they saw the end of the world with the Romans invading, not really invading, but being called to put down a revolt by the Jews in 66 AD, and they got around to Qumran sometime a little after that, and these people had prepared these big jars specifically built for housing all these documents, and they prepared everything very carefully, and then they stashed everything in these caves. Who knows how many of these documents we haven't found, or that had slipped into the black market, or were lost or destroyed. But what we did find eventually got assigned to the international group, or the international team of scholars who were mostly Catholic priests, Dominicans, and they were assigned to decipher all of these ancient texts and tell us what they say. They're mostly written in Hebrew, but some in Aramaic, and a few even in Greek. And, tell us what they say and stuff. The international team had a kind of a mandate to do that. And they, in the process of going through the documents, which apparently many of them thought, oh, well, these documents are a godsend because they're going to confirm the existence of Jesus, or they're going to confirm my beliefs, whatever my beliefs are. And then, as they were reading them, they discovered that they do not at all confirm your beliefs. In fact, quite the opposite. And at that point, they changed their tune, and then they started to stall and started to come up with excuses not to turn over the translations, publish the books that they promised they were going to publish. They would publish one book, but it was kind of on a peripheral matter or a text that's not really controversial or even scholarly worthy. Many of these texts were in small fragments. Some of them had to be put together like you would a jigsaw puzzle before you could read them. So I can understand that it would take a while. But these guys took like 45 years, and they only published, I think, 8 books. And of those 8, they're all pretty much not worth anything. All of the major important translations they hadn't delivered. I believe that these things have changed since Robert Eisenman and Davies had joined the kind of got on the case and like forced these documents out there, and then took pictures of them and sent them to any scholar who wanted to see them. But for many, many years, the situation was scholars were just waiting for these things to come out, and they were denied being able to look at them, even though they were like PhDs in the field and stuff. So anyway, that is the kind of the deception part of the Dead Sea Scrolls deception, or at least one of the deceptions. We're in chapter 7, which had to do with the Inquisition, basically, where these Catholic priests and the popes had really rebelled against or fought back against the rebel modernists of Catholicism, who were trying to take a more kind of realistic view of the Jesus story, that he was a heroic human as opposed to a god. And some of the things, the virgin birth and the bodily resurrection and certain other aspects that are very much kind of in the magical thinking category, they wanted to kind of temper those, but the popes fought back hard and pretty much destroyed these people, completely, excommunicated them. And so that's kind of where we are here in the mid-20th century as these things were discovered. And so we'll start up right here. One might expect this situation to have changed during the last half century, and especially in the years since the Second Vatican Council of the early 1960s. In fact, it has not. The École Biblique today retains as close an association with the Pontifical Biblical Association as it did in the past. Degrees at the École, for example, are conferred specifically by the Commission. Most graduates of the École, this is the École Biblique, is the group that these Dominicans are working for, are placed by the Commission as professors in seminaries and other Catholic institutions. Of the Commission's 19 official consultants today, a number are influential in determining what the public learns of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Thus, for instance, Father Jean-Luc Vesco, the current head of the École Biblique and a member of the Revue Biblique's editorial board, is also a member of the Pontifical Biblical Association. So too is at least one other member of the journal's editorial board, Jose Loza. So too is a prominent writer on the scrolls, a Jesuit named Joseph Fitzmyer, who has compiled the official concordance for much of the Qumran material. In 1956, the name of Father Roland Deveau, director of the École Biblique, appeared for the first time on the list of the Commission's consultants. He would have been appointed the year before in 1955, and he continued as a consultant until his death in 1971. The timing of DeVoe's appointment is interesting. In 1955, it must be remembered, much of the crucial and controversial sectarian material from Cave 4 was still being purchased and collated. In December of that year, indeed, the Vatican laid out money for a number of important fragments. In 1955, too, the Copper Scroll was unrolled in Manchester under John Allegro's auspices, and Allegro himself was beginning to go public in a potentially embarrassing fashion. Allegro was the British scholar who kind of was on the international team, but he was the renegade, and he, attempted to publish stuff. And he was pretty much thrown out of the group, and then he kind of went about it a little bit the wrong way, and he lost interest with academia, really. Allegro himself was beginning to go public in a potentially embarrassing fashion. The Vatican thus became aware for the first time of the kind of problems it might have to face in connection with the Qumran material then coming to light. The ecclesiastical hierarchy almost certainly felt the need of some sort of chain of command, or at least chain of accountability, whereby some measure of control could be exercised over the Qumran scholarship. In any case, it is significant, if not particularly surprising, that from 1956 on, every director of the École Biblique has been a member of the Pontifical Biblical Association. When DeVoe died in 1971, the Commission's list of consultants was updated to include the name of his successor at the École, Father Pierre Benoit. When Benoit died in 1987, the new director, Jean-Luc Vesco, became a consultant to the Commission in turn. Even today, and again, this book is old. This book is from 1991. So even today, the Pontifical Biblical Association continues to supervise and monitor all biblical studies conducted under the auspices of the Catholic Church. It also publishes official decrees on the right way to teach Scripture. In 1907, adherence to these decrees was made obligatory by Pope Pius X. Thus, for example, the Commission established by decree that Moses was the literal author of the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. Established by decree that Moses was the literal author of the Pentateuch. Basically, I'm forcing you to believe something that is completely outlandish. In 1909, a similar decree affirmed the literal and historical accuracy of the first 3 chapters of Genesis. More recently, on April 21st, 1964, the Commission issued a decree governing biblical scholarship in general, and more specifically, the, quote, historical truth of the Gospels. The decree was quite unequivocal, stating that at all times the interpreter must cherish a spirit of ready obedience to the Church's teaching authority. It further declared that those in charge of any biblical associations are obliged to observe inviolably the laws already laid down by the Pontifical Biblical Commission. Any scholar working under the Commission's aegis, and this, of course, includes those at the École Biblique, is thus in effect constrained by the Commission's decrees. Whatever conclusions he might reach, whatever the revelations to which his research might lead him, he must not, in his writing or his teaching, contradict the Commission's doctrinal authority. The head of the Pontifical Biblical Commission today is Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. Oh boy. He's the one that became Pope. Okay, Cardinal Ratzinger is also head of another Catholic institution, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. This designation is fairly new, dating from 1965, and probably unfamiliar to most laymen. But the institution itself is one of long-established pedigree. It has, in fact, a unique and resonant history behind it, extending back to the 13th century. In 1542, it had become known officially as the Holy Office. Prior to that, it was called the Holy Inquisition. Cardinal Ratzinger is, in effect, the Church's modern-day Grand Inquisitor. The official head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith is always the reigning Pope, and the executive head of the congregation is today called its secretary, although in earlier times he was known as the Grand Inquisitor. Of all the departments of the Curia, that of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith is the most powerful. Ratzinger is perhaps the closest to the Pope of all the Curia cardinals. Certainly they have many attitudes in common. Both wish to restore many pre-Vatican II values. Both dislike theologians. Ratzinger sees theologians as having opened the church up to corrosive secular influences. A deeply pessimistic man, he feels that the church is collapsing, and only the suppression of all dissent can assure its survival as a unified faith. He regards those who do not share his pessimism as blind or deluded. Like the Inquisition of the past, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith is in large part a tribunal. It has its own judges, the chief of whom is called the assessor. The assessor is aided by a commissar and 2 Dominican monks. These individuals have the specific task of preparing whatever investigations the congregation chooses to undertake. Such investigations generally pertain to breaches of doctrine on the part of the clerics or anything else that might threaten church unity. As in the Middle Ages, all investigations are conducted and pursued under conditions of total secrecy. Until 1971, the Pontifical Biblical Commission and the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith were supposed to be separate organizations. In reality, however, the separation between them was little more than nominal. The 2 organizations overlapped one another in a multitude of respects, ranging from their functions to the membership of their governing bodies. In 1969, for example, 8 of the 12 cardinals presiding over the congregation also presided over the commission. A number of individuals acted as consultants for both. At last, on June 27, 1971, Pope Paul VI, in an attempt to streamline bureaucracy, amalgamated the commission and the congregation in virtually everything but name. Both were housed in the same offices, at the same address, the Palace of the Congregation at Holy Office Square in Rome. Both were placed under the directorship of the same cardinal. And in 1981, that cardinal became Joseph Ratzinger. Numerous contemporary priests, preachers, teachers, and writers have been muzzled, expelled, or deprived of their posts by the body over which Ratzinger now presides. The victims have included certain of the most distinguished and intelligent theologians in the church today. One such was Father Edward Schillebeeckx of the University of Nijmegen in Holland. In 1974, Schillebeeckx had published a book, Jesus, An Experiment in Christology. In this work, he appeared in the eyes of his adversaries to be questioning the literal truth of certain dogma, such as the resurrection and the virgin birth. In December 1979, Schillenbeck was hauled before a tribunal of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, where one of his judges publicly accused him of heresy. He survived his investigation by the tribunal, but in 1983 he was again summoned to a tribunal of the Congregation, this time for his latest book, Ministry, A Case for Change. What were Schillenbeck's transgressions? If only tentatively he had questioned the Church's position on celibacy, he had sympathized with arguments for the ordination of women. Most seriously of all, he had suggested the Church should change with the times rather than remaining fettered to immutably fixed doctrines. The Church, he contended, should respond to and evolve with the needs of its faithful instead of imposing draconian codes upon them. He had argued, in short, for a dynamic pastoral approach, as opposed to the static one favored by Pope John Paul II and Cardinal Ratzinger. Once again, Schillenbeck survived the Congregation's investigation and interrogation. To this day, however, he remains under close scrutiny, and his every word, written or spoken, is carefully monitored. It goes without saying that such assiduously vigilant surveillance will exert a profoundly inhibiting influence. A more telling case is that of the eminent Swiss theologian Dr. Hans Küng, formerly head of the Department of Theology at the University of Tübingen. Küng was generally acknowledged to be among the most brilliant, most influential, most topically relevant Catholic writers of our age, a man who, following in the footsteps of Pope John the 23rd, seemed to offer a new direction for the Church, a new humanity, a new flexibility and adaptability. But Küng was also controversial. In his book, Infallible, first published in German in 1970 and in English the following year, he challenged the doctrine of papal infallibility, which, one must remember, had never existed in the Church until 1870, and had only then been established by a vote. No one is infallible, Küng wrote, but God himself. Further, quote, the traditional doctrine of infallibility in the Church rests on foundations that cannot be regarded as secure. Küng also recognized the distinction between theology and history, and the former's propensity to parade itself as the latter. He attacked the sophistry of such church scholars as Cardinal Jean Danielou, who in 1957 had published the Dead Sea Scrolls and Primitive Christianity, a work primarily of theological propaganda. Quote, theologians such as Danielou now bring an aura of pseudo-learning to the role of Grand Inquisitor, are appointed cardinals of the Holy Roman Church, and fulfill its expectations. After the election of John Paul II, Küng was critical of the new pontiff's rigidity in morals and dogma. Quote, is the Catholic theologian, he asked, going to be allowed to ask critical questions? Was John Paul II really free, Küng wondered, or of the personality cult which had bedeviled the earlier popes? And was he not perhaps excessively preoccupied with doctrine at the expense of the liberating message of Christ? Quote, can the Pope and the Church credibly speak to the conscience of today's people in a self-critical examination of conscience on the part of the Church and its leadership does not also simultaneously occur? Küng's outspokenness made him, of course, an irresistible target for the inquisitional tribunals of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Having evaluated his statements, the tribunal accordingly passed judgment. December 1979, the Pope, acting on the formal recommendation of the congregation, stripped Kung of his post and pronounced him no longer qualified to teach Roman Catholic doctrine. He was informed that he was no longer a Catholic theologian and was forbidden to write or publish further. Kung himself effectively summarized what had befallen him. Quote, "I have been condemned by a pontiff who has rejected my theology without having read one of my books, ever, and who always has refused to see me. The truth is that Rome is not waiting for dialogue, but for submission." Under the directorship of Cardinal Ratzinger, the congregation during the last decade has become increasingly entrenched, intransigent, and reactionary. Ratzinger is vehemently critical of all changes in the Church since the Second Vatican Council of 1962-5. The Church's teachings, he maintains, are being tarnished by doubt and questioning. According to one commentator, Ratzinger seeks a return to Catholic fundamentalism and reasserting the literal truth of papally defined dogma. Through the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Ratzinger's attitudes determine the attitudes of the Pontifical Biblical Commission, of which he is also head, and filter down from there into the École Biblique. During the course of 1990, these attitudes served to place the congregation prominently in the news. In May, the congregation issued a preliminary draft of the new revised and updated Universal Catechism of the Catholic Church, the official formulation of tenets in which all Catholics are obliged formally to believe. Allowing no flexibility whatever, the new catechism definitely condemns, along with a catalog of other things, divorce, homosexuality, masturbation, and sexual relations before outside marriage. It lays down as basic tenets of the Catholic faith papal infallibility, immaculate conception, and the assumption of the Virgin Mary, as well as the universal authority of the Catholic Church. In one particularly dogmatic passage, the new catechism declares that, quote, "the task of giving an authentic interpretation of the Word of God has been entrusted to the living teaching office of the Church alone." In June, we got enough. In June, there appeared a second document, publicized by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and written by Cardinal Ratzinger himself. This document addresses itself specifically to the functions and obligations of the theologian, a term intended to encompass the biblical historian and archaeologist as well. According to this document, approved and endorsed by the Pope, Catholic theologians have no right to dissent from the established teachings of the Church. Indeed, dissent is itself promoted or demoted to the status of an actual sin. To succumb to the temptation of dissent allows infidelity to the Holy Spirit. If a theologian begins to question the Church doctrine, he is thus, by skillful psychological manipulation, made to feel morally tainted for doing so. Any propensity to question is effectively turned back on the questioner and transformed into guilt, something in which the Church has always trafficked most profitably. In the same document, Cardinal Ratzinger states, quote, "The freedom of the act of faith cannot justify a right to dissent. This freedom does not indicate freedom with regard to the truth, but signifies the free determination of the person in conformity with his moral obligations to accept the truth." In other words, one is perfectly free to accept the teachings of the Church, but not to question or reject them. Freedom cannot be manifested or expressed except through submission. It is a curious definition of freedom. Such restrictions are monstrous enough when imposed on Catholics alone, monstrous in the psychological and emotional damage they will cause, the guilt, intolerance, and bigotry they will foster, the horizons of knowledge and understanding they will curtail. When confined to a creed, however, they apply only to those who voluntarily submit to them, and the non-Catholic population of the world is free to ignore them. The Dead Sea Scrolls, however, are not articles of faith, but documents of historical and archaeological importance, which belong properly not to the Catholic Church, but to humanity as a whole. It is a sobering and profoundly disturbing thought that if Cardinal Ratzinger has his way, everything we ever learn about the Qumran texts will be subject to the censorship machinery of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, will be in effect filtered and edited for us by the Inquisition. Given its obligatory allegiance to the Congregation, one is justified in wondering whether, quite simply, the École Biblique can be trusted. Even if the Israeli government clamped down and ordered the immediate release of all Qumran material, how could we be sure that items potentially compromising to the Church would ever see the light of day? We personally, in this book, should like to pose publicly certain basic questions to Father Jean-Luc Vesco, the École Biblique's current director. 1. If the École Biblique is accountable to the Pontifical Biblical Commission and the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, what are its responsibilities for scholarship? 2. How can any reputable academic institution function under the strain of such potentially divided, even mutually hostile loyalties? And 3. And what exactly would the École Biblique do if among the unpublished or perhaps as yet undiscovered Qumran material something inimical to church doctrine turned up? Okay, that's the end of the chapter, and that's the end of that section. Tomorrow we'll move into section 3, which is called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And chapter 8 is called the Dilemma for Christian Orthodoxy. We'll get into that tomorrow, so please return, and thanks for tuning in today.